Hello, this is Cal, the creator of Sacred Threads. This channel, it's a new channel, and I've been trying lots of different things. I hope you've been enjoying some of the videos I've been making on all sorts of church history topics, other related topics, explanations of parts of the faith. And I was researching another topic, which was the 14 Stations of the Cross, how this tradition started, and it was quite complicated, and I thought I'd try something a bit different here, which is a annotated lecture, shall we say, or a friendly lecture with a lot of accompanying images and video and a multimedia experience, shall we say. See if people like it, see if it is popular. I watch a lot of YouTube and a lot of people doing very interesting things, so I thought I'd try something a bit different, similar to things I've seen, but just to see how people react to it. And it's a way of trying to get a lot of different interesting topics into one complete video, rather than trying to dilute it down to something that's maybe a bit too short and you don't get enough. But we'll see how this comes together. A bit more free form, shall we say. So, the 14 Stations of the Cross, also known as the Via Crucis or the Via Dolorosa, the Way of the Cross, or the Way of Suffering, Via Dolorosa, the Way of Suffering, or the Sorrowful Way. It's quite hard to describe because it's a mixture of scripture and tradition, and it has developed over time. And the number 14 has, it wasn't always 14, people had different numbers, but it's curious how it's all kind of come together, and it took me quite a bit of research to sort of work this all out, and I'm going to go through each of the 14 steps, explaining where they come from, and use that as an opportunity to go into some more detail. So let's begin with Station 1. Jesus is condemned to death by Pilate. So the scriptural reference is obviously from Scripture, Matthew 27:26. Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So Pontius Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. He bows down to the pressure from the crowd, and this is obviously the beginning of the Passion. And what's interesting about it is there is tradition that Pilate himself ended up accepting Christ. I need to look more into that because it's quite an interesting tradition. Maybe I'll do another video on that. Let me know if you want any information on what happened to Pontius Pilate. Leave a comment below. There was relatively recently an engraving found of Pontius Pilate, which showed that he served under the Emperor Tiberius, who was the Roman emperor at the time of Christ's crucifixion. You can see here on the picture, you get the end of Pontius, but Pilatus, and then obviously Tiberius is up there at the top there, showing that he's serving under the Emperor Tiberius. So this is the beginning, and of course, within 37 years of this, the entire city of Jerusalem will be completely destroyed, as Christ said it would be. Not a stone would be unturned. So in AD 70, the siege of Jerusalem happens. This is when the Roman forces completely destroy all of Jerusalem. So while there is the Via Dolorosa today, which many people follow, it's not actually the path that Christ walked on, because it's really built above it. Everything in Jerusalem today is really built above the ruins of what happened in AD 70, when Titus commanded the forces to destroy Jerusalem. Of course, this was during the reign of Emperor Vespasian, and Titus would eventually succeed Vespasian as emperor, and he built the Arch of Titus to commemorate this victory, which you can see today. And there I've been there, and you can see the menorah on the Arch of Titus today. It's next to the Colosseum. It's obviously a very popular site, and it commemorates this important time. And so for a long time, obviously, there wasn't really much pilgrimage in the early days of Christianity within the church. Had to move out of Jerusalem because it didn't, it was completely leveled. So The church was moved in all directions. Obviously, people know the apostles went in all directions, but the Mediterranean was a key center of the churches being established, and sort of center point was moving further west of Christianity. And so there wasn't much pilgrimage going on up until the conversion of Constantine and his mother, the Emperor Constantine, in the early 4th century, and his mother, Saint Helena. His mother, Helena, famously went to Jerusalem with an army, essentially, a huge retinue of people to uncover the site of Jesus' crucifixion. A Roman temple had been built over Calvary, and that was taken down. And of course, tradition says that Helena found the true cross and wanted to test that it was the real thing by finding sick people in the local area and bring them to touch the cross and to see if they would be healed. And then she brought the true cross back with her. Possibly another video there, and because I'm amazed this hasn't been made into a major film. The story of Helena is just absolutely extraordinary, and we don't know that much about her. There's a lot of uncertainty about where exactly she was from and her own story, but she is obviously this key figure who brings Jerusalem back, really, and it suddenly becomes this Christian city as the Roman Empire is becoming more and more Christian. And then, of course, Constantine becomes first makes Christianity legal, and then is baptized just before he dies, and the Roman Empire is becoming more and more and more Christian, and so Jerusalem, which is under the control of Rome, is now a Christian city, and suddenly pilgrimages begin. We have one of the earliest stories of pilgrimage is a pilgrim known as Egeria, who writes in 380. They identify the churches which have been built, like the Church of the Ascension, under Helena, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was started to be constructed, and this pilgrim also visits the Gardens of Gethsemane and other sites. So this is kind of the sort of beginning of the whole Passion, and people being able to go to really see where it all happened, and this whole stations process is starting to develop, of following in the literal footsteps, not just the spiritual footsteps, shall we say. Then let's move on to station 2. Jesus takes up his cross. So scriptural reference here is John 19:17, Jesus carrying his own cross. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. So the cross was likely only the crossbeam, or the patibulum, carrying the full cross. I know in Passion of the Christ, Jesus carries the full cross, but I think that would probably have been a bit too heavy to carry. So I think most people think it would have just been the crossbeam, and then that would have been attached to this permanent vertical wooden beam where these crucifixions happened. Of course, there's probably disagreements about that. It's not really that important, but this is obviously Jesus taking up his cross as he instructs us to do. So 3, Jesus falls for the first time. Now, this is not actually in Scripture. There is no reference to Jesus falling in any of the Gospels. It's not too much of a stretch to think that this happened, and falls must have been common. You're being whipped, you're carrying a heavy wooden cross. Of course, he had been scourged beforehand, which is just the most horrifying experience you can imagine, and so falling is to be expected. Now, the next station, 4, Jesus meets his afflicted mother. Now, this is not explicitly in Scripture, but is based on Luke 2:35, Simeon's prophecy. And a sword will pierce through your own soul also, that thoughts out of many hearts may be revealed. So we know Mary was there. She is mentioned in Scripture as being at the foot of the cross, along with the other 2 Marys, including Mary Magdalene. And not too much of a stretch to think that she was there, and that she would have met her son as he walked up to Calvary, which must have been pure agony for her. Now, next we have station 5. Simon of Cyrene helps Jesus carry his cross. So the scriptural reference for this is Mark 15:21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. So why are Alexander and Rufus mentioned, his sons? It's probably because they were known in the Christian community that emerged after the Passion, and maybe even Simon himself was also a Christian. Cyrene is in modern-day Libya. It was a Jewish center at the time. It became an early Christian center. And it's very likely, or at least very possible, that Alexandra and Rufus were early Christians who might have been there themselves. But it was their father who was brought in. Apparently, from my understanding, this was quite common for the Romans to sort of press gang people into helping with this public humiliation ritual, and Simon of Cyrene was the man for the occasion. Now, next we have station 6, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. Now, this is not in the Gospels, this is from tradition. It seems very similar to Simon of Cyrene, but is not mentioned in any Gospel. This is quite interesting. Veronica I've done quite a bit of research on this. Her name, meaning true image, Veronica, true icon, that's the sort of etymology of the name, Veronica, true icon, i.e. the face of Christ with the blood on this cloth, or this veil, the veil of Veronica as it's called. There is that relic of that today. It's very interesting because she might have had a different name, but she became known as this, as the person who had this true image. It's quite similar to another thing that I've covered in a video, which was what happened to Saint Thaddeus. There is the tradition of Agbar of Edessa, who received an image of Christ, and this could have possibly been the Shroud of Turin. The Veil of Veronica has a bit of a similar story to the Shroud of Turin, in that it seems to have made its way all the way to the new center of Christian world, which is obviously in modern day Turkey and then in Rome as well. But again, it's very hard to find exactly any details, but this has clearly become a key part of the tradition of the 14 stations. On to station 7, Jesus falls a second time. I did find some indication that early medieval pilgrims carrying out the stations of the cross might have actually reenacted this fall. It's possible, but again, the 3 falls became the standard for these stations. So we'll go straight on to station 8. Jesus consoles the women of Jerusalem. So from Scripture, Luke 23:27. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore. Now, this is very interesting. This has a very prophetic style, a bit like Jeremiah and Isaiah. I believe it's foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem, which of course he said would happen. And you can imagine that these women would have been around, because remember, this is the man who rode in on Palm Sunday in the donkey, and it seemed as if it was going to be accepted, but of course it all changed dramatically, and I'm sure there were women there who were lamenting how this had all played out. Of course, they didn't know. No one knew that this was all meant to be. Station 9. Jesus falls a third time. So this is just before the actual site of the crucifixion, the lowest point before the sacrifice. And then station 10, Jesus is stripped of his garments. Scripture says in John 19:23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and made 4 parts, one for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was without seam, woven from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to see whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture, they parted my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. This is Psalm 22:18. Then of course we go on to station 11. Jesus is nailed to the cross, from Luke 23:33. So the crucifixion, I would recommend on this subject, there's an amazing video on Pints with Aquinas with Fr Andrew. I'll put the link in the description below. He gives a very, very in-depth look at both the crucifixion and the Shroud of Turin. He's a specialist on the Shroud of Turin, and he covers also the work done by modern doctors on how exactly crucifixions were carried out. It's very almost certain that the nails would have gone through the wrist. This would have been rather than the hands. Otherwise, they would have fallen off, and the victims would have suffocated rather than bled to death. It was a horrendous. I mean, you don't need me to tell you, it's a horrendous torture that is designed to maximize as much pain as possible. You're not just you've got this nerve within your wrist that is, has a nail through it. You have to breathe to stay alive, and as you breathe, it just causes agony in your wrists because you have to move up, and eventually you suffocate. So it was designed to be, the word excruciating comes from crucifixion. It is designed to be the most painful kind of death, as well as obviously designed to be as humiliating as possible too. And then, of course, we come to station 12. Jesus dies on the cross. So all 4 Gospels record this. So the key moment is darkness coming over the land, and it is finished, John 19:30. And traditionally during Stations of the Cross, a period of silence is held at this, a longer period of silence is held at station 12. On to station 13, Jesus is taken down from the cross. The scriptural reference here is Luke 23:50, where Joseph of Arimathea asks for the body, and then Mary receives the body, forming the image of the Pieta, the famous, especially well known as the carving of Michelangelo. The statue by Michelangelo is the most well-known Pieta image. Pieta meaning pity. Maybe my favourite painting of Jesus being taken down from the cross is this one by Renaissance artist Bernardino Butinone. It's just something very, very tender about it, and very solemn. And then, of course, station 14, Jesus is laid in the tomb. The scriptural reference here is Matthew 27:59-60. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. So the prophetic fulfillment here is from Isaiah 53:9, which is, and they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. So the grave obviously being the side of the crucifixion, with the wicked, the two criminals on either side of him, and with a rich man in his death. Obviously this Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy man, and this was his tomb, and no one had been in this tomb, and so this was the virgin tomb, just like the virgin womb. So both at birth and at death, both the tomb and the womb only had room for one. But that's part of it being holy, in that it is only for God. And of course the tomb was likely a rock-hewn chamber with a rolling stone. Obviously this many visualizations of this, similar to the tomb that Lazarus was risen from. So, how did this all come together? Well, there's not one set thing, but it seems as if the Franciscans were the ones who really popularized this 14-station format in around the 17th to 18th centuries. Of course, St. Francis himself is responsible for the first nativity scene, and so it makes sense that another great tradition that we see today is also from the Franciscans. But it seems to have begun with the earliest pilgrimages to Jerusalem. There were replicas built quite early on, I believe in the 5th century in Bologna. There were chapels that represented the important shrines of Jerusalem, the important points of the Via Dolorosa. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been quite a lot. Let me know if you found this insufferable, if you found it interesting, if you thought you'd like more of these kind of slow, interesting visual looks into the early church and how things came to be. I like to think I'm quite good at finding and making it is easy to understand where some of the things we do come from. It's always important to ask, why do we do these things? We don't just do them because people have done them. They have a reason, they have an origin, they have a purpose, and I don't think we explain it enough, to be honest, with a lot of you just sort of assume to know. So I try to do my best to explain certain things, not just I'll leave the theology to the great theologians, but the more practical reasons for things I think could be better explained, and I hope I'm doing my part in that. So thank you.